Next, we move on to section 7(1) capital A, supply of goods or supply of services. And this list is given in schedule 2. Okay. See, first under section 7(1) capital A schedule 2, we talk about transfer of what? Transfer of title of goods, transfer of right in goods. If it is transfer of title in goods, it is a supply of goods. You're transferring your title, so you are supplying goods. If you're only transferring right in goods, right to use the goods, then you're supplying service, not goods. Similarly, in case of hire purchase, you will transfer the title in future, so it is considered as supply of goods. In case of transfer of undivided shares in goods without transfer of title, if it is with transfer of title, it automatically is supply of goods. But if it is transfer of undivided shares in goods without transfer of title, then it is supply of service. Next, land and building. If it is lease, tenancy, easement of land, supply of service. Lease, letting out of building, wholly or partly, supply of service. Basically, land and building both, whether it is lease, letting out, tenancy, it will be considered as supply of service. Number 3, next we have treatment and process. If treatment and process is applied to another person's goods, it is considered as supply of service. You are providing a service. If you are doing a treatment or process to your own goods, then it is considered as a manufacturing activity and it is a supply of goods. If it is treatment process applied to another person's goods, supply of service, you're providing service to the other person. Treatment process to your own goods, it is a manufacturing activity and it is a supply of goods. Right? Next is transfer of business assets. This I had given you a little more explanation already while discussing section 7 subsection 1. Permanent transfer of business asset with consideration is supply of goods. Permanent transfer without consideration, but if ITC is availed, it is again supply of goods. Permanent transfer without consideration, but if ITC is not availed, then it is not a supply and there is no GST. Right? In these two cases, if permanent transfer of business asset is done with a consideration, whether ITC availed, not relevant, in both the cases it will be supply of goods. But if without consideration, only if ITC has been availed, only then it is a supply as per section 7 subsection 1c. But if ITC not availed and without consideration, not a supply, no GST. Next is if it is a temporary transfer of business asset or for self-use for non-business purpose. Temporary transfer or for personal use, not for business purpose, then it is a supply of service, not supply of goods, remember. If it is a temporary transfer, here we were talking about permanent transfer, but here we're talking about temporary transfer. If it is a temporary transfer or for self-use for non-business purpose, it is a supply of service. Next is if the person ceases to be taxable person who owns the business assets, he ceases to be taxable person, then his business assets will be deemed to be supplied. His business assets will be deemed to be supplied and it will be supply of goods. Unless, of course, there are two exemptions here. Okay. First of all, if It will be deemed to be supplied by him in course or furtherance of business immediately before he ceases to be taxable person. Okay. So the person, if he ceases to be a taxable person, his business assets will be deemed to be supplied by him in course or furtherance of business immediately before he ceases to be taxable person. It will be a supply of goods unless business is transferred as a going concern. Business is transferred as a going concern, or if business is carried on by representative who will be a taxable person uh, by virtue of compulsory registration, right? By virtue of compulsory registration. So transfer of business assets, permanent transfer with consideration, ITC avail, not avail, supply of goods. Permanent transfer without consideration, it is supply of goods only if ITC avail. If not avail, not supply, no GST. In case of temporary transfer or self-use for non-business purpose, it is a supply of service. If a person ceases to be a taxable person, his business assets will be deemed to be supplied by him in course of furtherance of business immediately before he ceases to be a taxable person, unless business is transferred as a going concern or business carried on by his representative who will become a taxable person by virtue of compulsory registration. Now this will be so in case of transfer of business assets, in all the cases it is supply of goods. Only in case of temporary transfer or self-use for non-business purpose, it is supply of service. Next, renting of immovable property is a supply of service. Construction of a complex building, civil structure is again supply of service. These both are immovable property, these are all supply of service. Except where entire consideration received after completion certificate, first occupancy, whichever is earlier. If it is received after this date, it is not a supply. We already discussed enough on this. Next is temporary transfer of IPR. What is IPR? Intellectual property right. In case of temporary transfer of intellectual property right, for example, trademarks, patent, copyrights, etc., it is a supply of service. In case of a permanent transfer, if you're making the transfer of IPR like trademark, making the transfer permanently, then it is a supply of goods. But if it is only a temporary transfer, it is a supply of service. In case of software, if it is a pre-packed software like something like Tally, then it is a supply of goods. But if it is only an upgradation, or if it is customized designed software implementation, or if it is development, in all those cases it is a supply of service. If it is a pre-packed software like Tally, supply of goods. If it is an upgradation, customized software, if it is an implementation of software, development of software, upgrading the software, in these cases it is a supply of service and not goods. Next is agreeing to obligation to refrain, to tolerate, or to do an act. If you uh, agree to not do a particular act, for example, if you agree to an obligation to not uh, commence commence a particular business, and you are offered a consideration for it, if you are agreeing to such an obligation, it is a supply of service. Okay. Next is transfer of right to use any goods for any purpose for a consideration. Right to use, it is not title, right? It is only transfer of right to use any goods for any purpose for a consideration is a supply of service. Next is composite supplies is always supply of service. Composite supplies, under composite supply what comes is works contract. Under here, how is it? Because there's material and there's labor, right? In case of restaurant and catering, there is service and there is food. There you are providing food, and you are providing service also. Here also you're providing goods and you're providing service also. So it is a composite supply. In case of composite supplies, it is always supply of service. Finally, the last one is supply of goods by unincorporated association or body of persons to members for a consideration. For example, if you are a part of a club and if the club has a bookshop, a bookstore, and the books in that bookstore is provided or is available to the members only at discounted price, so then in that case it is a supply of service. Example, the bookstore for members at discounted price. Although there is a service element here, it is considered as supply of goods. So what is it? Supply of goods by unincorporated association or body of person to members for a consideration. In that case, it is a supply of goods. So here we end section 7, scope of supply.